Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our esteemed viewers, on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Mohammed Al Nuaimi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you to lecture number 754 of the ECSSR's lecture series, titled The Impact of COVID-19 on GCC and Global Oil and Gas Markets. Our guest today is Mr. Christophe Roule, an internationally renowned economist and senior scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Throughout his career, he has been widely quoted and published in a variety of areas that involve macroeconomics and energy economics, and brings more than 20 years of experience holding senior positions in world-class organizations such as BP, the World Bank, and the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, to name a few. We look forward to this discussion in which we hope to learn more about the current state of energy markets, in particular with regards to our region. So I'm delighted to invite Christophe Roule to give us his insights, and afterwards I'll be asking a series of questions to further explore the topic at hand. Mr. Roule, over to you, sir. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. Christophe Roule here, joining you from the Black Forest today in Germany, where there's also a pandemic like everywhere else. I think to approach that topic, the pandemic, the economic consequences, the energy consequences, and what it means for the GCC, I will split the talk just in these four segments. Talk a little about the pandemic and the relationship to the economy and energy markets, and have a bigger block on what the complications and the implications are for global energy markets, in particular, of course, the oil market and oil prices, and then turn to the GCC and ask the question, what does that, the bad economic news and the difficult energy market news mean for that particular part of the world? So let's start at the beginning. What I would like to establish is I'm German, you can tell, a little bit of order in looking at these things. Because people talk about the pandemic and the economy and the energy markets and their own experiences, it all starts to blur, especially after a few weeks of lockdown. My first point is we should be aware that there's a clear hierarchy. There is energy markets, and they are dependent on the economy. Energy demand depends on economic activity more than anything else, full stop. So the energy markets are hostage to the global economy. There is a global economy which is no longer just humming along and is doing well or poorly depending on economic circumstances, because now it's impacted by the virus. So it's fair to say the global economy is hostage to the virus. So what we have is a hierarchy. There's what the virus does in the pandemic and then the reactions to it. There's the economic consequences of that, and there's the energy consequences of the damage to the economy. And what we have seen, of course, is when the virus broke out, the immediate reaction across the world was pretty synchronized. It didn't always happen at the same point in time, but the pattern was the same. There was recognition that a pandemic is there, a dangerous virus, and then there was lockdown. Everywhere, at some point in March, April, 60%, 70% of global GDP was in countries where there was a lockdown imposed, and it still goes on in many countries. So basically, you try to isolate people, limit activities, and that shuts down the economy for a while. The idea at that time was that this would damage the economy, but that once the virus was under control, economic growth would restart. And the idea how it would be restarting was this famous V-shaped recovery. So everybody was prepared to admit there's a virus, and the virus means that the economy grinds to a halt because we have lockdowns and quarantines. The economy collapses, but then once the virus is under control, it will, just in the same way its synchronized collapse will restart, and that will be the famous V-shaped recovery. What does it mean? It means that there was a hope that by the end of the year 2020, we would be back at the activity levels, the economic activity levels, which we had at the end of the year 2019 or at the beginning of the year 2020. A sharp decline and a sharp recovery. This is no longer so clear. What has happened with economic forecasts is that for a while, every forecast was turning worse and worse and worse. There was hardly any improvement. People still talk about a V-shaped recovery, but now the second leg of the V is delayed into 2021. So the overwhelming opinion now is to say, okay, this economic impact is much more difficult and the virus is not going away, and so it will take longer. And therefore, we still will have a V-shaped recovery, but it will not be at the end of 2020 back to where we were at the beginning of 2020. It will be maybe at the end of 2021 back to the beginning of 2020. And I personally think the more we look around us, the less certain this becomes. I think the first insight we have to draw is that, yes, the world went down in a very synchronized way, but now we are seeing a great divergency across regions, great differences, and it is really sort of, we have to accept and we have to say hello to this divergency with recovery. It's different in different areas. China faster, the US slower, even within Europe, the UK slower, Germany faster. And then overall, on the global level, what we see is a pretty severe impact on now the emerging markets. Brazil, India, these countries suffer much more, will take much longer. And the overall infection rates, of course, still being larger than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, this saying goodbye to the V-shaped recovery and hello to diversification across regions and countries has, of course, immediate consequences for energy markets and for oil markets. And to demonstrate this, let me just show you a few pictures. The idea for energy and oil markets was also that we had a V-shaped recovery. Here we see some indicators how uneven the virus actually, or that it really doesn't disappear. You see the collapse on the right side. These are commercial flights, airplane flights. And you see the very, very gradual global recovery. On the left-hand side, you see traffic in China. The red up and down, this is traffic jams in normal years, and the blue one is traffic jams since the corona crisis. Also, even today, not fully recovered. So it's not happening that we have this very rapid reshaped recovery. Here we see just some standard forecasts, how they're getting worse and worse, with the exception of OPEC, which still thinks that the world only declines by about 4%. Most economic forecasters now think that global GDP will fall by about 5 to 6% this year. And then there's still the hope that it will come back. And this is what I wanted to show you. Looking at energy now and oil prices, this is what happened to oil prices during the last few months, since the beginning of that year. They collapsed pretty much, and then you see that very steep blue decline. This was when prices turned negative very briefly because storage was too full. And now they recovered, but they stay pretty evenly. And here is the V-shaped recovery, but not for the economy, but for energy demand. Yeah? So the idea that the economy would have a V-shaped recovery would, of course, immediately translate, in this example, into oil demand. Oil demand would also collapse, and we saw it did. That's already historic data. And the hope was that it would come back within that year in parallel with the economy, so that at the end of 2020 or at the beginning of 2021, we would be back where we left the system at the end of 2019, at the beginning of 2020. If I am saying that it is unlikely for the virus to go away and for the V-shaped recovery to happen in a synchronized way around the world, the implication is that this picture here for oil markets also is unlikely to happen. And come to the second point, the impact on energy markets. So first point again, the expectation of a V-shaped recovery turns out maybe not true because the virus is more complicated, doesn't go away so far. The economy is more complicated, recovers at different speeds and different. The implication for oil markets is clear. There will be no immediate recovery. Now, what has happened in oil markets? After demand collapsed by about 20%, in the wake of the economic collapse, there were two reactions immediately. One was that oil producers, which were organized in OPEC or in a group called OPEC+, mostly state-owned oil producers under the leadership of Saudi Arabia and Russia, together in April in an emergency meeting, virtual meeting as the sign of the times, the guidance and the prodding of the agreement of the Trump administration and around the G20 leadership of Saudi Arabia. And they made a decision to cut supplies. And the decision was to cut supplies by almost 10 million barrels per day, the biggest supply cut ever implemented. And that supply cut was then to be phased out until the end of 2021. So it was a 2-year program, which is still in force, to cut supplies, just simply to stem the tide because demand was collapsing, the inventories were getting full, prices as I said earlier, falling into negative territory. So it was a very dramatic situation. The second, which happened, and you saw that on one of the slides, was that prices collapsed. And collapsing prices, that will limit the supply of private producers. They cannot be ordered by their government to cut production, but when prices go to $40, $30, $20, they will stop producing. So from both sides, from the government-controlled energy sector, oil-producing sector, and from the private sector in countries like Brazil or the US or the North Sea, we should have seen drastic supply cuts. And that is very important, because when you have all of a sudden demand falling by 20%, as we had in April and March, and you don't cut supplies, you have inventories swimming and becoming overloaded, and prices going so low that the whole system just grinds to a halt, and that you may even have again negative prices. But the idea of cutting supplies, of course, also relies on the idea that demand is going to pick up at some point. Because when you only cut supplies but nobody wants the remaining oil, you have not really dealt with the problem. So in a way, the idea of OPEC Plus and also the markets was that we need to cut supplies because then demand will take care of the problem. And that was also based on this idea of a V-shaped recovery. And the question is, does that happen? Did demand really sort of come back? And will it take care of the problem? And again, let me show you here in terms of slides. You see again on the left-hand side the collapse in oil consumption. So this is the demand side. And you can tell that the right-hand side is more or less a broken line. This is a projection. And it is not by accident that this projection exactly looks like a V. So in energy markets, forecasters took the model of the economic forecast, not surprisingly, and said, okay, we need this V-shaped recovery. In the meantime, we cut supplies, and then the system will go back to normal. And what you see on the right-hand side, the collapse in 2020 is for real. We already see that, and we see that it comes partially from the OECD countries, partially from other countries. But the increase in 2021 is just a projection. To the extent that we have this big recovery in 2021, if demand does not take up, this will not happen. And we will have for longer depressed oil prices. And my third big point is that when the oil market is a mirror image of the economy, there is a real big risk that we will not get this recovery, which you see here in 2021, and that demand will stay durably lower. And that would mean that oil producers, including in the GCC, would have to cut their production for a much longer time than they actually planned. And let me add one more point to that. Oftentimes, people, this looks like a complicated graph, but it's not. Oftentimes people now talk about peak oil demand. The question whether even without the pandemic, at some point oil demand globally would stop growing. The reason that this becomes a much more real proposition is here visible in these graphs. What the left-hand side here shows you is oil intensity. This is how much oil you need to produce 1 unit of GDP globally, $1 of GDP. Here it shows you how many barrels you need, $1,000 of GDP globally. You can see in the 1980s, 1970s, you needed almost 1 barrel, 158 liter, to produce $1,000 worth of global GDP. It's an enormous amount when you think of it. That's how important oil is. Since then, the efficiency with which oil is used, and that's what this graph shows you, has declined systematically year by year by year. Nowadays, you need about 70 liters, less than half a barrel, to produce $1,000 of global GDP. As it happens, this line in the middle here from 1985 to 2015 shows you the annual efficiency improvements, how oil intensity got better and better and better, and we got more and more efficient using oil. And what is amazing about this is that it is extremely regular. It almost looks like a straight line. So what we can do is we can take that and we just make no assumptions about electric cars or this or that or the other thing. We just assume that this straight line will continue. We match it with standard economic growth forecast, and it will tell us if the system continues to work like this, that oil demand without pandemic should have peaked by the late 2020s. Now, that's not a forecast. It could be by the 2030s. It could be earlier. The point here is that the system very systematically and stable moves into a direction, not surprisingly, where eventually oil demand will peak. And now what has happened with the pandemic is that people say the pandemic may have brought this point forward because of this collapse in oil by about 20%. And I think that is a very real danger. So without going into further sort of technical details, it is quite likely that we see oil demand peaking in a few years' time. And some people claim that we won't even go back to the production levels which we had in the year 2019. Why does that matter? Because when you now think again about the GCC region and about OPEC countries, it is one thing to live in a growing oil market. And this is what we have had since the 1970s. In that growing oil markets, low-cost producers can cut production, that increases prices, and over time, because the market grows, they will gain back their volumes, and because they charge higher prices, they make more money. In a shrinking market, all of that changes. In a shrinking market, if you're an oil producer and you want to keep your production constant, it's possible only if you compete production away from somebody else. In order to keep your share constant, somebody else needs to lose because the market is shrinking every year. So that means in a shrinking market, you will see local producers competing on price with low prices to produce as much as possible. We had a first taste of that in the so-called oil price war, when Saudi Arabia suddenly, before the pandemic, started to produce flat out as much as they could in order to enforce discipline with Russia and other people. We will see much more of that. Peak oil demand matters because it means that the oil producers in OPEC and including in the GCC will no longer have the power to restrict volumes and increase prices. They will have to compete on volumes, and prices will be presumably lower than in the previous world. So it will be a more difficult period to end. And I think that is where we're going. So now, again, let me summarize and then come to the GCC. V-shaped recovery is in doubt. V-shaped recovery for the economy is in doubt. That means V-shaped recovery of oil prices is in doubt, despite the supply cuts. And in addition, it is quite likely that the pandemic has accelerated the point in time when we will see peak oil demand. Maybe we see it in 5 years, in 10 years, nobody can tell you, but it is something which we see now coming up on the horizon for the first time. And when we have peak oil demand, the whole system will change, and it will be much harder for oil producers in the GCC to come up with decent revenues because they will have to compete on price and can no longer cut production and get high prices, and then the system grows out of it. So last question then, how well prepared is the GCC for such a world where we would have durably lower oil revenues? Because that's what it all comes down to. I want to show you something which I find very disturbing. But before I show it to you, I want to make sure that you don't shoot the messenger. Because we all know what needs to be done in order to be prepared for an age of lower oil prices. One needs to diversify the economy. One needs to have other sources of revenue, not just oil. Everybody says it, everybody knows it. It is something which is extremely difficult to do. And within the GCC, of course, you have big differences between different countries, how far they find this road. In the UAE, this is fairly well advanced. There's a system of sovereign wealth funds. There's a system of money invested abroad. There is industries and tourism in the country which are independent from oil. In other countries, it's not so fair advanced. But what people think of is that this is a process which, is happening. And what I'm going to show you is that we have to be much, much more careful before we claim victory. And as I said, there's no reason to shoot the messenger, but it is a picture which is, this is the GDP of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries as a whole. And you see it's divided into two segments. One is called oil GDP, and the other is the famous non-oil GDP. Now, what this means usually is oil GDP is the GDP which comes directly from oil production. So that one wants to shrink over time. Non-oil GDP is things like the airlines and service industries and hotels and industrial production, things which have nothing to do with oil. That's the theory. Now, this is a construct used by the IMF and by all kinds of authorities. And so people tend to believe it. And it looks pretty good. When you look at this, GDP was more than 50%, was the majority until 2007. And since then, in a gradual process, non-oil GDP has increased its share. While GDP rose overall, the share got bigger. And here in 2018, the last year for which we have complete data, was almost 60%. So it seems we're on the right track. And we can look at this in the long term on the left-hand side, and look at it on the short term, over the last 10 years now. And it seems, this is non-oil GDP here, it seems it has grown its share all the time. So it's moving in the right direction, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but in the right direction. Now what happens is when I overlay that picture with something very simple, oil price, changes in the oil price, all of a sudden, look at this, it turns out non-oil GDP, which is supposed to be independent from the oil price, grows every single year when the oil price grows and falls every single year when the oil price comes down. This is exactly, it's not supposed to be the case. This is supposed to be independent from the oil price. So why is that? And I think this is just an indication for how difficult it is, because this whole construct of oil GDP and non-oil GDP is basically like saying, okay, an oil worker, he goes on his oil rig and he works during the day, that's oil GDP. Then at night, he goes to his hotel, he orders dinner, he goes to sleep, that is non-oil GDP. And the world isn't that simple. It just tells us that even the non-oil GDP in GCC countries is very tightly linked to the oil price. And I'm just flagging that, again, not to belittle anybody's effort, but as a warning sign. It will be extremely difficult to really diversify the economy away. And we can discuss that in more detail. I have graphs also on the employment being concentrated in governments and foreign employment being concentrated in the private sector, all these consequences which we know of. But the fourth point is that even in the GCC, even among the well-to-do countries like the Emirates, there's no true independence of the non-oil GDP from the oil price. It still moves with the oil price. That's disappointed, but not surprising, because there's a big source of revenue. The way to address that is exactly the way has been done in the UAE and is planned in Saudi Arabia, which is to take the money, invest it somewhere abroad, outside the oil market, outside the oil, and then live from the proceeds once oil prices come down and the region is running out of oil. But this is a summary I would give. The virus more troublesome than we first expected. The V-shaped recovery of the economy, unlikely, going to be much more diversified and all over the place. The impact on energy markets, direct impact will be lower oil prices for longer. The indirect impact will be that even peak oil demand may come sooner than we think. The impact for the GCC is durably lower oil prices. And the question, how will they deal with it? The answer is it will be very painful, because it will require adjustment which will hit both parts of the economy, the oil-dependent and the non-oil dependent parts.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I mean, you've outlined a lot of very important subjects, especially for us here in the GCC, such as the oil demand and oil production levels and how that may impact, the GCC in general. It was interesting to note how tightly coupled, in your example, that oil GDP is to non-oil GDP, which is a worrying factor, I suppose. And certainly needs to be, more needs to be done in terms of diversifying our economies. I mean, the question I would put to you, sir, is GCC states, okay, obviously are committed to their strategic and economic plans and knowledge-based economies to diversify national income sources and reduce dependence on oil and gas as a primary source of national income. So what are the most, in your view, the most critical challenges that must be addressed to achieve a more diversified and sustainable economy in the region?
The critical challenge, I think, is in the end in the financial sector, in setting up long-term savings vehicles across the region, not only in the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia has now done that, but when you look at their sovereign wealth fund, it still can't decide. Is it a short-term money maker? Is it long-term saver? Is it a domestic development bank, which almost by definition would make losses? What exactly is the function here? And we have to recognize it's not only to have money in the bank for a rainy day, it is also because this financial system in the GCC is in a place. We have a financial system where the exchange rate is tied to the US dollar, but where oil demand increasingly shifts now to sources of growth in Asia. And when you have a fixed exchange rate, you need to have enough reserves in that particular currency. And when you start selling your oil into China or others, you don't get dollars for it. You get ultimately attempts of countries to replace it with their own currency. And so one needs to safeguard that system, because once the reserves are running down too much, you will see occurring against the fixed exchange rate. And that would be, that I think is at the moment a real danger, where we're in this transition and where the GCC is really hit twice by low oil prices, by low global economic growth. If the reserves were to be depleted, you would see speculation against that currency. That's the short-term fix. And then the long-term, there is no other solution but the painstaking, slow development of building up alternative investments, building up tourism, building up the airlines further, doing things where there's a geographic advantage, like having healthcare centers to which people can come, just as we currently have tourism centers, building up these kind of industries. That's on track, very different speeds in different countries, but it's a race against time.
Sure. Do you think, in your opinion, when do you think oil and gas can be considered a non-strategic commodity outright? So something that economies will not rely upon as a primary sort of driver of their economies.
Right now, some people consider it strategic, some people don't. But oil is the single biggest fuel among all the different fuels. And as long as you still need, think about this, about 70 liters of oil to produce $1,000 of global GDP, that means oil goes directly or indirectly into any kind of economic activity. As long as this is the case, it will be a strategic commodity. As long as transport grinds to a halt without oil, it will be a strategic commodity. As long as you cannot have warfare without oil, it will be a strategic commodity. So even if oil peaks, and even if the share of oil in the global energy mix suddenly would or gradually would diminish and would no longer be the biggest, even then it would remain a strategic commodity for a very long time to come. And one of the prime reasons is the near monopoly it has in transport.
In terms of the coronavirus pandemic, what is the impact of this pandemic, what has been the impact on global investments and in the future as well?
I think the most intelligent thing I've heard about the pandemic, someone saying, was an article, and he argued that this pandemic is not a turning point in history. The opposite, what this pandemic does is it accelerates trends which are already existing. And I think this is very true in many dimensions, and the economy is one of them. There was already a long-term trend towards slower economic growth. And I think the pandemic will diminish investment and will slow economic growth even further. Think about oil markets. There was already a trend towards peak oil demand. The pandemic will accelerate that trend. Think about investment. There was already a trend to invest less in oil and more in alternative energies. The pandemic will accelerate that as well. So it is conceivable that if the economy recovers faster than expected, that there was a lack of energy investments and that we then have shortage of spare capacity. But I think that's a very, very small probability. I think when you go back, when OPEC Plus was founded, the alliance between Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other countries to control oil markets, they started at the beginning in January 2017. They started because oil prices were very low and inventories were high. And so what they did was they wanted to rebalance inventories. They thought it takes 6 months. 3 years later, at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic hit, they were still at it. It was so difficult. The inventory levels which we have now are much higher than the inventory levels we had in 2017. So to rebalance the market will be a multi-year project.
I have one more question for you, sir, if you don't mind. It's about the economic consequences of the pandemic, especially considering the substantial government spending, government programs that have been deployed to keep the economy alive, to keep the economies active. Yeah. So what are your views on that?
That's a very good question, because right now, the fact that we don't see a much bigger economic collapse is only because of this massive government support by debt and by money creation directly. And it's amazing, for economists, when you have a deficit of 5% or more, this is red flags go up traditionally. Say you can't have that, unsustainable, blah, blah, blah. The US this year is going to have a deficit of close to 20%. And what the amazing thing is, because the Federal Reserve is so active buying bonds and bringing down interest rates, the US will pay less interest for this 20% deficit than they did in 2019 for a deficit with, 3 or 4 or 5%. because the interest rate has come back so much because the central banks are flooding the markets with money. So what does that mean? I think in the long term, we are facing a severe danger of inflation in the developed economies. I think this will happen as soon as the economy runs up against capacity constraints, either because capacity shrinks because nobody invests anymore, or because a recovery takes place. And I think it will be very dangerous because we have a whole generation of people in the financial sector among politicians who have never seen inflation. They don't know what it means. It will be very tempting for politicians in particular who are confronted with this huge debt in their budgets and households. They will say, okay, a little bit of inflation can't hurt because it does, of course, inflate away the debt. And that can go out of hand very quickly. I'm old now, so I'm old enough to remember when you still had inflation in some countries, and it's quite horrible, especially when people are not used to it. And it hits, of course, the poorest one. It hits pensioners and everybody on a fixed salary who is not flexible. And I'm afraid that one of the consequences, again, of the pandemic, where it accelerates developments which would have happened anyway, is that eventually inflation has to return. For years, people were asking, how come we print all this money and there's no inflation? There's no real sound explanation yet. But I think, it's like the laws of physics, the laws of economics. At some point, they come back, and that will happen.
No, thank you so much for your insights once again, Christoph. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today. At the end of this discussion, and on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Mohammed Al-Nuaimi, we would like to once again thank Mr. Christoph Ruhl for sharing his observations and perspectives, as well as our esteemed viewers. Indeed, we look forward to welcoming you to our future events, and thank you very much.